My name is Nora Halstead. I'm 33 years old and I've spent the last 9 years as a senior underwriter at a regional bank, which is a polite way of saying that it is my job to look at a stack of numbers and tell you the truth about what they mean, even when the truth is inconvenient for the person who brought me the stack. 4 days before my wedding, I found the truth about my own life sitting in a folder I hadn't gone looking for. It started with a printer. My fiancé Preston's home office printer had jammed, and he'd asked me from the shower, half shouting over the water, to grab the final vendor contract off his desktop so I could print it downstairs on the one that worked. I sat down at his laptop, which he never locked when he was home, because in 9 years of dating he'd never once given me a reason to think he needed to. I opened his file browser. I typed vendor into the search bar, and because his desktop was a graveyard of folders with names like MISC, 2024, and receipts do not delete, the search also returned a folder called Cabo March, dated for a business conference he had told me 3 months earlier was in Denver. I want to be honest about what I did next, because the version of this story where I gasped and slammed the laptop shut and cried into a dish towel is not what happened. I'm not built that way, and frankly neither is my job. When a loan application doesn't add up, I don't have the luxury of an emotional reaction. I have to keep reading until I understand exactly what I'm looking at, so I opened the folder. Inside were 7 photographs. A hotel balcony overlooking a beach that was very clearly not Colorado. A woman I recognized, Vivian Cho, 32, an associate architect at Preston's firm, someone I had shaken hands with at 2 holiday parties and 1 closing dinner for a project called the Halloway Residences. A boarding pass screenshot with a departure date that matched, almost to the hour, a weekend I remembered clearly, because it was the weekend I had been in North Carolina helping my sister Camille pack up her house before her family's move, a favor nobody had asked Preston to help with and he hadn't offered. I sat very still for what I later calculated, based on the shower still running when I finished, to be about 11 minutes. Then I did the thing that I do for a living. I built a timeline. I want you to understand something about me before we go any further into this story, because it matters for everything that comes after. I have always been the one who checks the math. In my family, in my relationship, in every room I have ever sat in, I have been the person other people hand their unbalanced numbers to, trusting that I will find a way to make them balance without making anyone look bad. I have been good at this job for so long that nobody, including me, thought to ask what it was costing me. That's usually how it goes. Nobody notices the accountant is drowning, they just notice the books are clean. By the time Preston came downstairs in his towel, hair still wet, asking cheerfully whether I'd found the contract, I had already copied 6 files to a personal drive that lived nowhere near our shared cloud account. I told him yes, I'd found it, it was printing. And then I asked him, in the same tone I might use to ask if he wanted eggs, how the Denver conference had gone in March. He said it was good, long, exhausting. The hotel Wi-Fi had been terrible, he said, which was, I noted quietly, an unusually specific detail for a lie that didn't need one. I did not say anything else about it that night. I did not say anything about it the next day either. I want to be honest that some of you listening are going to find that hard to understand, maybe even hard to forgive. I have had time to think about why I did it, and I've landed somewhere I believe is true. I wasn't protecting him. I was buying myself 4 days to find out whether this was the only lie, or whether it was one thread in a much larger piece of fabric that had been woven around me for years by more people than just him. It turned out to be the second thing. But that discovery, and the 4 days that followed it, and what I chose to do with a seating chart, a printed itinerary, and a guest list I had already quietly rewritten, that's the story I'm going to tell you today. Before I take you there, though, I have to take you much further back, because the truth is that what happened in that office with the jammed printer wasn't really the beginning. It was just the moment the machinery finally showed itself to me in daylight. And once you see machinery like that clearly, you start noticing it was built a long time ago by people who had a lot more practice hiding it than my fiancé did. If you've ever been the one everybody calls the strong one, the one who fixes things quietly, who doesn't cause scenes, who gets thanked with a hug instead of an apology, welcome back to the channel and stay with me on this one because I think it's for you. If this story sounds familiar to you in any way, drop a comment and let me know which part landed. and subscribe if you want more stories like it, because we've got a long road to walk together before we get back to that wedding. Rewind who we were before any of this. Let me take you back to where this really starts, because a story about a wedding is never actually a story about one day. It's a story about every day that trained you to accept what happened on that one. I grew up in Marsh Hollow, a small town about 40 minutes outside of Richmond, Virginia, in a split-level house with green shutters that my father, Gordon Halstead, always meant to repaint and never did. My mother, Diane, worked part-time at a dental office and ran the house the rest of the time, which in our family meant she also ran the emotional temperature of every room. I have one sibling, my younger sister Camille, who is 29 now, 4 years younger than me, and who was, from roughly the age of 5, the son our whole household orbited. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because it's simply the architecture of the house I grew up in, and you need to understand the blueprint before I show you what got built on top of it. Camille was the kind of child adults described as a lot of personality, which is a phrase people use for children whose big feelings they find charming, as opposed to the phrase they use for children whose big feelings they find exhausting. I was the second kind. I was quiet, methodical, and my mother's words said with a kind of tired fondness that I mistook for a compliment for about 25 years, low maintenance. Camille cried, and the house rearranged itself around her tears. I cried twice that I actually remember, and both times my mother told me some version of "you're the older one, you don't need to make this harder." I have 3 memories from childhood that I think explain everything more efficiently than 100 vague ones would. The first, I was 9, Camille was 5, and we both wanted the same bicycle for our birthdays, which fell 11 days apart in October. There was one bicycle in the budget that year. I know this now because I've since seen the receipts filed away in a box my mother kept, out of what I think was guilt more than sentiment. The bicycle went to Camille. I was told gently that I was old enough to understand, and that I'd get my present a little later when money came in from my father's overtime. My present arrived 4 months later. It was a second-hand bicycle from a neighbor, the tires slightly too small. I remember being told how grateful I should be that the neighbor was willing to give it to us for free. The second, I was 14 and I'd made the state finals for a regional math competition, the first time anyone from Marsh Hollow Middle had qualified in 9 years. The finals were on a Saturday. Camille had a dance recital the same afternoon, 30 minutes away in the opposite direction. My mother went to the recital. My father dropped me at the competition and then left to go support Camille too, telling me he'd be back for the awards. I placed 3rd in the state. Nobody from my family was there to see it. When I got home, the first question I was asked was whether I'd remembered to record Camille's recital on the camcorder, because my parents had forgotten to ask a neighbor to do it. The third, I was 16, Camille was 12, and she broke a lamp in a fit of anger during an argument about a curfew that wasn't even hers yet. She was arguing on principle, for some future curfew she anticipated resenting. My mother's exact words, which I remember precisely because I wrote them in a journal that night, underlined twice, were, "Nora, can you go clean that up before your father gets home? You know how he gets, and Cammie's already so upset." The fourth, and I think in some ways the quietest and most telling, I was 17, filling out financial aid forms for college applications by myself at the kitchen table, because neither of my parents had gone through the process before and both had told me separately that they trusted me to figure it out, a phrase that felt like confidence at the time and reads now like abdication. I remember calling the financial aid office of my top choice school myself, on a landline, asking questions I'd had to look up how to phrase, because there was no one in my house who could tell me what an EFC was or why it mattered. Camille, 5 years later, filling out the same forms for community college, had my mother sitting beside her the entire evening, asking the school's admissions office 3 separate follow-up questions on her behalf. When I mentioned this once, gently, years later, my mother said, "Well, you never seem to need the help." I didn't tell her that not seeming to need help and not needing it were 2 very different sentences, and that nobody had ever bothered to check which one was actually true. That's the shape of it. Camille's feelings were whether systems the whole household organized itself around. Mine were logistics to be managed quietly on my own time so as not to add to the forecast. I don't think my parents were monsters. I want to be fair here because I've had a long time to sit with this, and monsters would actually be easier to write off. My father worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood and was simply tired in a way that made him defer most decisions to my mother. My mother, I think, was repeating a pattern from her own childhood. She was the younger of 2 sisters, and she has told me more than once, almost wistfully, about how her older sister always just handled things. She wasn't cruel, she was unconscious. She built a family economy where usefulness was rewarded with responsibility, and charm was rewarded with rescue, and she never noticed she'd built 2 entirely different currencies for her 2 daughters. By the time I was 18, I understood the family rule without anyone ever having to say it out loud. Camille's problems were emergencies. My problems were inconveniences best resolved by me quickly so everyone else could get back to Camille's emergencies. I want to tell you that I resented this the whole time, that I saw it clearly for what it was. I didn't. For most of my life, I read this pattern as evidence that I was simply more capable, more mature, more resilient, someone who didn't need the things Camille needed. It took me a very long time to understand that being told you don't need something is not the same as not needing it. It's just a more efficient way of making sure you never ask. That's the soil this whole story grew out of. And once you've been raised in that soil, you don't just carry it inside your family. You carry it into every room you walk into afterward, including, eventually, the one where you meet the man you think you're going to marry. Escalation year by year. Age 22, the Kasen beginning. I graduated college with a finance degree and a job offer at a regional bank in Richmond, the same bank I still work for today, 11 years later. Camille, 18 at the time, was starting community college with plans to transfer and needed a car to commute since Marsh Hollow had no public transit worth mentioning. My parents did not have the money for a car. I did, not much, but enough because I had worked through college and lived at home the summer after graduation to save for my own first apartment. My mother called me on a Tuesday evening. I remember it was a Tuesday because I had a system back then of doing my banking on Tuesdays, and I was annoyed at the interruption to my one organized evening of the week, a small, telling detail about who I already was. "Nora, honey," she said, "I know this is a big ask, but would you consider cosigning a car loan for your sister? Just cosigning. She'll make every payment. You know how responsible she's gotten." I want you to notice the phrase, "you know how responsible she's gotten," because it's doing a lot of work. It's flattering Camille's growth while implying that any doubt I might raise about her reliability would be small and ungenerous of me. It's also notably not actually a fact. Camille had never held a loan, never had a credit card, had no income beyond a part-time job at a smoothie shop that paid $9 an hour. There was no actual evidence of responsibility. There was only the family's faith that she would grow into it. A faith that had never once been extended to me because I'd never needed it. I'd simply always been assumed responsible, the way some children are assumed to be 6 feet tall by the time they're fully grown, even at age 9. I cosigned. The loan was for $11,400, an amount I remember because I have, in the years since, spent an unreasonable number of evenings looking at old paperwork, trying to locate the exact moment the pattern calcified. Camille made the first 4 payments. Then the smoothie shop cut her hours and my mother called again. "It's just this once," she said. "You'd rather it not hit her credit right at the start, wouldn't you? She's got so much ahead of her." I paid $380 a month for the next 14 months while Camille got back on her feet, a phrase that outlived its own timeline by about a year. I told myself this was fine because I was the one with a stable job and family takes care of family, and it wasn't like I was going without anything essential. This was the first rationalization, and I want to name it clearly because it's the one that all the others were built on top of. I told myself that because I could absorb the cost without visible damage, the cost didn't count. Age 24, the emergency fund. 2 years after the car loan, Camille broke up with the boyfriend she'd had through most of community college, a breakup that came with a lease she could no longer afford on her own and, as far as I could tell, no actual plan beyond calling our mother in tears at 11 at night. I remember this chapter distinctly because it was the first time the request came directly to me, rather than filtered through my mother first, which felt at the time like a kind of promotion, proof I told myself that Camille trusted me, that we were becoming the kind of sisters who could ask each other for things directly instead of routing everything through Mom. I understand now that it wasn't trust, it was efficiency. Going straight to me simply skipped a step. I just need somewhere to land for like 2 months, Max, Camille said, sitting on my apartment floor with a box of her belongings, 20 years old to my 24. I promise I'll pay you back for groceries and stuff once I'm working again. 2 months became 5. I want to give you the exact numbers because vague memory is exactly the kind of thing this family relied on to keep the ledger fuzzy enough that no one could ever add it up cleanly. $1,100 in groceries and utilities over those 5 months, none of it repaid. 1 month of my rent, $950, covered in full when Camille's part of an informal roommate arrangement fell through and I didn't have the heart at the time to ask her to leave with nowhere to go. And a used laptop, $410, that I bought her in month 3 so she could apply for jobs online since hers had died and she didn't have the money to replace it herself. I told myself at 24 that this was simply what a good sister did, that Camille was young, that she'd find her footing, that the money mattered less to me than it would to almost anyone else in a similar position since I was single, had no dependents, and had, by then, a decent salary and no debt of my own. Every one of those things was true. None of them were the actual reason I said yes every single time. The actual reason, the one I couldn't yet name at 24, was that saying no had never once in my entire life been presented to me as an option that wouldn't cost me something in how the family saw me. There was one evening that month I still think about. Camille had gotten a call back for a job interview and was nervous about what to wear, and we'd stayed up late going through my closet, laughing about a truly unfortunate blazer I'd bought in college. And for about 2 hours that night, none of it felt like an economy at all, it just felt like having a sister. I want to hold on to that evening honestly, the same way I hold onto the hospital waiting room with Preston years later, because it's proof that the warmth in these relationships wasn't fake. It just wasn't ever weighed the same as the cost. Camille moved out in month 6, into a studio apartment funded partly by a new job and partly, I learned only recently, by a small gift from our mother that nobody had mentioned to me at the time, $600 quietly given while I was in month 5 of unrepaid groceries 3 rooms away. I didn't know about that $600 for almost 8 years. When I finally did, during one of the many nights I spent going back through old messages after the Cabo folder, it didn't even register as a fresh wound. It registered as one more line item in a ledger I was only now, for the first time, allowed to actually read in full. Age 26, the wedding that wasn't mine. Camille got engaged at 22 to a man named Derek and married him the following year at 23. I was 27. The wedding cost, according to the invoices I later found in a shared family email account my mother had, for reasons I still don't fully understand, given me the login to years earlier, $34,600. My parents contributed $9,000. I contributed $14,200, framed to me not as a loan but as helping Cammy start her life off right, the way we couldn't really do for you since you never wanted a big wedding anyway. I want to sit with that sentence because it's one of the cleanest examples of the machinery I can give you. Nobody had ever asked me if I wanted a big wedding. I hadn't had the opportunity to want one since I wasn't engaged. The assumption that I didn't want one wasn't drawn from evidence about me. It was drawn from the family's need to explain to itself why the resources kept flowing one direction, and the explanation it landed on was that I simply required less. Once a family decides you require less, every dollar and every hour they don't give you gets quietly rebranded as a preference of yours, rather than a deficit created by their decision. At the wedding itself, my mother introduced me to distant relatives as Camille's sister. She's the practical one, she works at a bank. A description that took up 4 seconds and contained no information about my life, my accomplishments, or who I actually was outside of my usefulness to the day's finances. Some of which the seating chart software, the vendor spreadsheet, the day of coordination when the florist ran 90 minutes late. I had also quietly handled myself. A cousin, my mother's niece Priya, found me in the kitchen at one point refilling ice and said something I still think about. You know, you're allowed to just be a guest sometimes. She meant it kindly. I remember laughing it off and saying I didn't mind. That was the first time anyone outside my parents' generation had noticed the pattern out loud, and I filed it away without understanding yet how much weight it would eventually carry. Age 28, the twins. Camille had her twins, a girl and a boy, when she was 24 and I was 28, and I want to tell you about this chapter carefully, because it's one of the few from this period where I don't think anyone acted with anything but love, and it still cost me something nobody in my family ever noticed I'd paid. The twins came 6 weeks early, which meant a NICU stay, which meant Camille and Derek needed help at home with almost no notice. I had at the time a work conference in Austin I'd been selected for months earlier, a genuine professional opportunity, one of only 3 underwriters chosen from our regional office to attend a training that my manager had told me directly was often a precursor to promotion. I canceled it the day I heard about the NICU. Nobody in my family asked me to. I want to be precise about that because it's important to the shape of this whole story. By that point, 28 years old, I had internalized the family's priorities so completely that I didn't even wait to be asked anymore. I simply did the math myself, the way I did every other kind of math, and concluded that my conference was the lower number. I used 9 days of unpaid leave. I hadn't been at the bank long enough yet to have much accrued to stay at Camille and Derek's house, cooking, doing laundry, driving Derek back and forth to the hospital so Camille could stay with the babies, since only one visitor was reliably allowed at a time in those early days. I don't regret those 9 days. I want to say that clearly because this isn't a story about resenting the twins, or even really about resenting that stretch of time itself. What I resent, looking back, is smaller and quieter than that. Nobody ever asked what it cost me. Nobody, once the twins came home healthy, ever said, "We know you gave up something for this, thank you for that specifically." I got the same general, diffuse gratitude I always got, "You're so good, Nora, we don't know what we'd have done," which is a genuinely warm thing to hear, and also, I've come to understand, a way of thanking the function rather than the person. Nobody thanks a bridge for being a bridge, they just keep walking across it. There's a small warmth in this chapter too, and I want to give it its full weight because my niece and nephew are 2 of the people in this story I love without any complication at all. On the 5th night, unable to sleep, I sat in the NICU family room at 2 in the morning with my nephew, who'd finally been cleared for a short visit, 5 pounds of him against my chest, and I remember thinking with a clarity that surprised me that I would do all of it again gladly 100 times over for him specifically. That feeling was real. It still is. It's just never been the same feeling as being seen. Age 26 to 28, Marcus briefly. Before I tell you about Preston, I want to tell you about someone else because I think it matters for understanding why I was so ready at 29 to mistake attentiveness for something rarer than it actually was. I dated a man named Owen for almost 2 years in my mid-20s, an easy, comfortable relationship that I ended, not him, 3 months before my sister's wedding, for a reason I couldn't fully articulate at the time and have only understood clearly in hindsight. Owen was kind. Owen was steady. Owen was also, I realize now, a man who related to me almost entirely through my usefulness. He'd comment admiringly on how I'd organized his taxes one weekend, or handled a dispute with his landlord over a security deposit, or planned his mother's 70th birthday party essentially alone while he helped with the guest list, which meant forwarding me a list of names over text. I don't think Owen was unkind. I think, like my family, he simply never had a reason to look past what I did for him to ask who I actually was underneath it, because the version of me that handled things worked well enough for him that there was no incentive to dig further. I ended things with Owen on a Tuesday evening. Again, a Tuesday, my banking night, and I remember noting the coincidence even in the moment. After realizing, sitting across from him at a restaurant, that I had spent the entire dinner listing logistics I'd handled that week, and he had spent the entire dinner nodding along without once asking how any of it had actually felt to carry. I told him as gently as I could that I didn't think he really knew me. He looked genuinely confused and said, "Of course I know you, Nora. You're the most reliable person I've ever met." I remember driving home that night thinking that reliable was the kindest sounding word in the English language for useful, and that I was exhausted at 26 by how many people in my life seemed to think those were compliments rather than descriptions of a role. I spent the next 2 years mostly alone, by choice, working, seeing friends, going to therapy for the first time. This was actually where I met Dr. Akaffer originally, years before the wedding crisis, in a much calmer season of my life, working through what I'd started to name, even then, as a pattern I didn't yet have full language for. I want to be honest that those 2 years were some of the steadiest of my adult life, not because I wasn't lonely sometimes, but because for the first time since childhood, nobody's comfort depended on my managing anything for them. So when Preston showed up at 29 and asked me follow-up questions, actual questions, about how things felt, not just what I'd handled, it landed on ground that had been carefully, deliberately cleared. I want you to understand that I wasn't naive when I fell for that attentiveness. I was starving for it in a very specific, very earned way after a lifetime of being loved almost exclusively for my output. That's not a flaw in me. But I think it's worth naming because it's part of why the eventual betrayal cut as deep as it did. It wasn't just that Preston lied. It's that the thing he offered me at the beginning, the thing that made me finally let my guard all the way down, turned out to have an expiration date I didn't see coming in a life that had already taught me over and over that being truly seen was rare enough that I shouldn't expect it to last. Age 29, Preston and the Ames family economy. I met Preston Ames when I was 29 at a mutual friend's dinner party. He was 32, an architect at a firm called Farrow & Kite, sharp and funny, and this mattered enormously to me at the time, given everything you now know about my family, genuinely, consistently attentive. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered details from conversations weeks later. For the first 18 months, I would have told you and did tell friends that dating him felt like being handed a mirror that finally showed me clearly after years of being seen only through my usefulness. Preston's family had money, not extraordinary money, but comfortable, established money, the kind that came from his father Richard's decades running a mid-sized commercial real estate firm in the city. And here is where the second thread of this story starts, the one that would eventually braid itself around the first. Camille, through a connection I made completely innocently, ended up working for Richard Ames's firm. I want to be honest that I introduced them. Camille had been floating between administrative jobs for years, unhappy and underpaid, and when Preston mentioned his father's firm was hiring an office manager, I mentioned Camille, thinking I was doing something generous and simple, the kind of favor any sister might do. I did not anticipate that this single introduction would become a load-bearing wall in a structure I wouldn't fully see until years later. Camille got the job, she was good at it by most accounts. But she was also, within about a year, deeply enmeshed in the Ames family orbit in a way that went well past employment, invited to Richard and his wife's holiday parties, given a company car allowance that seemed generous for an office manager role. And this is the detail that matters, quietly given a personal loan by Richard Ames of $22,000 when her husband Derek's small contracting business hit a rough patch. A loan I only learned about 2 years later, and only because I stumbled on a text thread, not because anyone told me directly. At the time, though, all I saw was that my sister had landed on her feet again. My mother was thrilled that the families were getting so close, and Preston and I were, by every visible measure, happy. Year 1 of the engagement, age 31. Preston proposed when I was 31 at a restaurant overlooking the river in a moment that felt, and I want to be honest about this because it matters, completely genuine. I don't think Preston is a cartoon villain, and I'm not going to tell this story as though he were. I think he is a man who was very good at being present when it cost him nothing, and who discovered, somewhere in the murky middle of our engagement, that being present had started to feel like a job with deadlines instead of a choice he kept making. The first year of the engagement was good. We planned in the reasonable, unhurried way of two people who liked each other and weren't in a rush. The friction when it started was small enough that I explained it away using the same tools I'd used my whole life. He's busy, the firm's slammed with the Halloway project, this is just what engagement stress looks like. There was one comment from that year I want to flag, because it's a perfect example of a guilt trip phrase dressed as a value. We were discussing venues, and I'd pushed back gently on a budget line that felt inflated, a florist quote of $6,800 that seemed high even for a wedding our size. Preston said, "I just think you're always the one doing the math, Nora. Can't we just enjoy this instead of turning it into a spreadsheet?" I remember feeling, in the moment, faintly ashamed, as though caring about numbers made me smaller somehow, less romantic, less trusting. It took me a long time afterward to recognize that comment for what it actually was, an invitation to stop paying attention, offered by someone who had a growing interest in my not paying attention. I want to give you a small warmth here, because this story isn't pure misery and it shouldn't be told as though it were. That same year, my father Gordon had a minor heart scare, nothing catastrophic, but enough to land him in the hospital overnight for observation. Preston drove 4 hours round trip after work to sit with me in the waiting room, brought my father a crossword book he remembered my dad liked from one dinner conversation 8 months earlier, and stayed until 1 a.m. without once checking his phone. That night I believed completely that I had found someone who saw me the way I had always wanted to be seen. I want you to hold on to that memory the same way I did, because it's part of why everything that came later was so disorienting. People who are only ever cruel are easy to leave. People who are sometimes genuinely wonderful are the ones who take years to see clearly. The engagement party, age 31. 6 weeks after Preston proposed, our two families held a joint engagement party at the Ames family's house. 60 guests, catered, the kind of event I understood even then to be as much about Linda and my mother's growing social alliance as it was about celebrating us. I want to walk through one specific hour of that evening because I think it's a clean, contained example of how quickly the two families' machinery had already begun operating as a single system, months before I had any reason to suspect Preston himself of anything. Early in the evening, Richard Ames pulled my father aside. I only learned the content of this conversation 11 months later, when my father finally told me about it, unprompted during one of our newly honest phone calls after the wedding, and suggested warmly that since the families are joining, it might make sense for Camille to take on expanded responsibilities coordinating both families' events going forward, given how well she'd apparently handled the party logistics that evening. My father, uneasy but not quite sure why, mentioned it to my mother, who thought it sounded lovely. Nobody mentioned it to me at all, even though I was the one actually engaged, even though the families joining was definitionally about my relationship rather than Camille's employment. I found out about that conversation the same week I found out about the $22,000 loan, 2 separate arrangements, made in 2 separate years, both engineered around me without ever quite including me. There was a toast that night given by my mother that I want to give you nearly in full because I think it captures better than almost anything else in this story the precise emotional register the family used to describe me for most of my life. Nora has always been the one who makes sure everything runs smoothly, she said, glass raised, 60 faces turned toward us. I don't think Preston knows yet just how lucky he is. She'll take care of everything. I remember smiling through that toast, glass raised along with everyone else's, and I remember, too, a small, quiet ache underneath the smile that I couldn't yet name, the sense that even at my own engagement party, the compliment being paid to me wasn't about who I was. It was, once again, about what I would do. Preston, to his credit, in that specific moment, leaned over during the applause and said quietly, just for me, "You know you don't have to run point on all of this, right? I mean it. I want this to be something you get to enjoy too." I remember believing him completely. I want to be fair in telling you this story that I believed him because there was real evidence at that point that he meant it: the hospital waiting room, the crossword book, a dozen small gestures across our first year together that had nothing to do with usefulness at all. That's part of what made everything that came later so disorienting to sit with afterward. The same man who said that sentence, and meant it at 31, was also within a year, a man capable of a folder labeled Cabo March. I've come to believe both of those things can be true about the same person at different points in the same relationship, and that believing that doesn't make me foolish for having trusted him. It just makes the story a human one instead of a simple one. Year 2 of the engagement, age 32. This was the year the pattern accelerated, and I want to walk through it carefully because it's the part of the story where the two threads, my family and my fiancé, start to visibly intertwine. In March, Camille and Derek's contracting business took another hit, this time from a client who defaulted on a $17,500 invoice. My mother called me, not Camille, to ask if I could help out a little, framing it as a loan Camille would repay once the business stabilized. I want to note something here. My mother did not call to ask if I was in a position to help. She called to arrange that I would. There's a difference, and it's one of the clearest signs of the machinery. You are not asked whether you have the capacity. You are informed of the need with the capacity already assumed. I gave $4,000. Reasonable, I told myself, compared to the full amount. I did not mention this to Preston, partly out of habit. My finances and my family's requests had always felt like a closed loop I managed alone, and partly, I think now, because some part of me didn't want him to do the math on how much of my savings for the wedding kept quietly leaving the account. In June, I learned, again by accident, this time from an offhand comment Camille made at a barbecue, thinking I already knew, that Richard Ames had also stepped in that same month, covering a $9,000 gap in Derek's business insurance renewal, in exchange for Camille agreeing to take on additional unpaid duties managing Richard's daughter's upcoming charity gala. Camille said, cheerfully, "Isn't it nice having two families who just take care of things?" I remember smiling and agreeing while doing the silent math on how completely I had become one half of a two-families system I had never been consulted about joining. In August, Preston's work trips began increasing in frequency. Denver twice, Chicago once. Each trip came with a specific, almost defensive level of detail about hotel Wi-Fi, conference schedules, colleagues attending, details that, at the time, I read as thoroughness. I understand now that I was being handed a paper trail I wasn't yet suspicious enough to check. The way you don't examine a receipt closely if you have no reason to think the total is wrong. There's a line from that year I want to give you because it's the closest thing to the reasonable-sounding manipulation this story turns on, and it came not from Preston but from my mother during a phone call about wedding planning where I'd mentioned, lightly, that I was feeling stretched thin managing both the wedding budget and Camille's ongoing requests. "You've always been so good under pressure, Nora," she said. "It's just who you are. I don't worry about you the way I worry about Cammy." I want to name the machinery explicitly here, the way I eventually learned to name it to myself, because this is the sentence that unlocks the whole pattern. That's the machinery of it. They don't ask you for help. They simply arrange the world so that only you can fix it, and then they thank you sincerely, warmly for being generous, as though generosity were a fixed trait of your character rather than a role you were assigned before you were old enough to negotiate the terms. Being told, "I don't worry about you," isn't a compliment. It's a confession that no one is checking on whether you're okay. It's the quiet, comfortable flip side of being told your whole life that you're the strong one, a phrase I would eventually come to think of as a job title nobody paid me for, and one I was, at that point, still the last person in the family to read the fine print on. Year 2, autumn, the bachelorette weekend. In October of that same year, 10 months before the wedding, Camille organized my bachelorette weekend, a genuinely thoughtful gesture on paper. 3 nights at a lake house 2 hours outside the city, 8 of us total, including 2 of Linda Ames's nieces, whom I'd met exactly twice before and hadn't expected to see on the guest list. I remember being touched at first that Camille had put in the effort. I didn't yet understand that the guest list itself was a small window into how thoroughly the two families had already merged their social planning without me. The weekend was, on its surface, lovely. Wine, a lake, a rented photo booth. Camille had spent, she told me proudly, $340 on, money I later realized had come out of a girls' weekend fund. I had unknowingly contributed $600 to myself at Camille's request 3 weeks earlier. Framed as everyone chipping in evenly, a claim that turned out, once I finally saw the reconciled group expenses 8 months later during the file building week, to be untrue. I had paid for nearly half the weekend meant to celebrate me. There was a moment on the second night I want to give you because it's small, and it's exactly the kind of detail that means nothing in isolation and everything in hindsight. Around midnight, slightly drunk, one of Linda's nieces, a woman named Kayla, maybe 26, clearly more comfortable with the wine than with the room's dynamics, turned to me and said, "It's so nice Preston's finally settling down." Vivian always used to joke he'd be a bachelor forever. I remember laughing along, assuming Vivian was simply a work friend of his I hadn't met yet, filing the name away with no particular weight attached to it at all. Camille, sitting 2 seats over, went very quiet for a moment, then changed the subject to the photo booth. I didn't notice the quiet at the time. I noticed it 11 months later, rebuilding the timeline on my kitchen floor, and it was one of the first small proofs that the machinery around me had more moving parts and more people quietly turning them than I'd ever let myself imagine. I want to be fair to that weekend, too, because not every part of it belongs in the ledger of harm. My oldest friend from college, Bate, who'd flown in from Seattle specifically for it, pulled me aside on the dock the last morning and said, without any context I understood at the time, "You seem tired in a way that isn't just wedding planning tired. I don't know what it is, but if you ever need to just say it out loud to someone with zero stake in your family, I'm here." I told her I was fine. I believed mostly that I was. I've thought about that dock conversation more times since the wedding than almost any other single moment from that whole year because Bate, a person with no history in my family's economy at all, saw something in 30 seconds that it took the rest of us 33 years to name. Year 3, 6 months before the wedding, age 33. By early in our final engagement year, the wedding planning had accelerated. The guest list had ballooned to 210 people, largely at the insistence of my mother and Preston's mother, Linda, who each seemed to be using the event as a networking opportunity for their respective social circles. I had, by this point, taken over nearly all the logistics, vendor contracts, the seating chart, deposit tracking on a shared spreadsheet I maintained obsessively, partly because it genuinely was my skill set, and partly, I think now, because it was the only part of the wedding where I felt I had any control at all. In February, 6 months before the wedding, my mother asked me for $6,500 to help cover Camille's twins' preschool tuition shortfall for the coming year, framed once again as something Camille would pay back once things stabilized. A phrase that had by this point appeared in family conversations so many times it had stopped meaning anything at all. The way a word repeated aloud too many times starts to sound like nonsense. I said no for the first time in 11 years. I want to be honest that saying no did not feel powerful in the moment. It felt terrifying, like stepping off a ledge I'd been standing on so long I'd forgotten it was a ledge at all. My mother's response was quiet and devastating in its quietness precisely because it didn't need to be loud to land. "I just thought with everything Cammie's been through and everything you have now with Preston with the wedding that you'd understand. I guess I was wrong about that." That sentence is doing an enormous amount of work, and I want to break it down the way I would break down a loan application that didn't add up. It positions my no as a betrayal of Camille's hardship, even though Camille's hardship, twins in preschool, a contracting business with cash flow problems, was not in any material way caused or worsened by my boundary. It ties my capacity to Preston's money, as though marrying well was itself an obligation to redistribute wealth to my family, a debt incurred simply by being loved by someone with resources. And it ends on "I guess I was wrong about that," which is not an acceptance of my no, it's a soft, sorrowful accusation, engineered to make me feel the cost of my own boundary more sharply than the cost of the request itself. I held the no. It was the first time I had, and it cost me 3 days of my mother barely speaking to me and one phone call from Camille that began with "I don't need your money if that's what you're worried about," which was, notably, not what I had said, and which she followed with 15 minutes about how hard things had been, in a call I had not initiated and had not, in fact, brought up money to begin. I want to give you another small warmth here before we move into the part of the story that gets hardest, because you've earned it, and because this is roughly the midpoint of where we're headed. That same week, my father, quiet, tired, rarely one to intervene in anything between my mother and me, called me on his own without telling my mother and said, "You did the right thing saying no." I should have said no more myself over the years. "I'm proud of you for figuring it out before I did." It was one sentence, and it was the only time in my adult life my father had ever directly acknowledged the pattern out loud. I still have the voicemail. I've listened to it more times than I'd like to admit. If you've made it this far, you already know this story has more turns coming. If any part of this has felt familiar so far, drop where you're at in the comments, because I read every one, and hit subscribe if you want to make sure you catch part 2 of the story when it lands. Because what's coming next is the part where the two threads, my family and my fiancé, finally cross. 4 months before the wedding, the declined card. In April, 4 months before the wedding, I had my first small, concrete piece of hard evidence that something in my finances didn't match what I'd been told, though at the time I read it as an accounting error, not a warning. Preston and I kept a joint account for wedding expenses, funded roughly evenly, though I want to be honest, looking back at the spreadsheet now, that roughly evenly had quietly drifted over 18 months into something closer to 60-40 in my favor. A drift I'd noticed and, true to form, absorbed without comment, telling myself it evened out with other things Preston covered elsewhere. That month, a vendor deposit for the band, $1,200 due on the 15th, was declined. I remember the mild, ordinary embarrassment of it, standing in the venue coordinator's office, running the card twice before switching to my personal one to cover it on the spot. When I mentioned it to Preston that evening, expecting some simple explanation, a hold, a mistiming with his paycheck, he said, a little too quickly, "Oh yeah, I moved some stuff around this month, work trip expenses hit before the firm reimbursed me. I'll make sure it's covered by Friday." It was covered by Friday. I didn't think about it again until the file building week, 5 months later, when I finally cross-referenced our joint account statement against the dates in the Cabo folder, and found that the work trip expenses that had drained the account that particular week were not, in fact, reimbursed by his firm at all. They were a resort charge dated the 9th of April, 4 days before the declined card, for a location 2 states from where his calendar said he'd been. I want to name something about this specific memory because I think it's one of the clearest examples in this whole story of how thoroughly I'd been trained not to look. In April, with the declined card sitting right in front of me, I had every piece of information I needed to ask a harder question. I had access to the statement. I had the date discrepancy if I'd looked closely. What I didn't have yet was the belief that I was allowed to go looking. The belief that a small irregularity in my own joint account was mine to investigate rather than his to explain away on his own timeline in his own words. That belief didn't arrive until a jammed printer forced the folder into my hands directly 4 months later, and I think about that gap often. 4 months during which the truth was, in a sense, sitting quietly in a bank statement I had every right to open, waiting for me to finally give myself permission to look. 3 months before the wedding, the first real crack. In May, 3 months before the wedding, I overheard, genuinely overheard, not snooped, though I want to be honest that by this point in the story I was primed to notice things I might once have let pass. A phone call between my mother and Linda Ames, Preston's mother, while I was setting the table for a joint family dinner and my mother had stepped into the next room. Phone pressed to her ear, voice pitched low in the specific register people use when they think a door is closed further than it is. "She's always been the sensible one, so I really don't think it's anything to worry about," my mother said. "Preston works so hard, Linda, and Nora understands that better than anyone. I told him myself when they first got serious she's not going to make a fuss over anything small." I didn't know at the time what anything small referred to. I assumed reasonably that it was some ordinary engagement friction, a disagreement over venues maybe, or a scheduling conflict. It didn't occur to me, not yet, that my own mother had apparently made some kind of assurance to my future mother-in-law about how little I would notice or push back on regarding her son's behavior. I filed the comment away the way I'd filed away so many others over the years, slightly uneasy, but not yet equipped with enough evidence to know what it meant. I want to tell you what I did with that unease at the time because I think it's a useful window into how deeply the pattern had settled by that point in my life. I didn't ask my mother what she'd meant. I didn't ask Preston if anything was wrong. Instead, that same week, I quietly reorganized the entire wedding day of timeline, color-coded by vendor, adding a full extra buffer hour I hadn't planned before, as though the correct response to a vague, unnamed unease about my own relationship was to tighten my grip on the one part of the day I still had full control over. I remember feeling almost soothed by it, by the spreadsheet, by the neat rows of vendor arrival times, the same way I'd always been soothed since childhood, by fixing the thing in front of me instead of naming the thing underneath it. There was a second, smaller moment that same week I hadn't thought about again until I began building the file. Preston had come home distracted one evening, later than expected, and when I asked lightly how his day had gone, he said, "Long." Vivian and I had to redo the whole Halloway presentation. Client hated the first draft. It was an ordinary sentence, delivered in an ordinary tone, and I remember thinking nothing of it at all. Vivian was, as far as I knew, simply a colleague, one name among a dozen he mentioned in the course of an average month at the firm. I didn't yet have any reason to hold on to that sentence. 4 months later, rebuilding the timeline with a spreadsheet of my own, I found that the date matched within 2 days one of the trips filed under Cabo March, and I understood finally that even the ordinary sentences had been doing quiet work all along, hiding in plain sight the same way the whole arrangement had. That equipment arrived 4 days before the wedding in a folder called Cabo March. The discovery. I've already told you the broad strokes of what I found on Preston's laptop. The photographs, the boarding pass, the dates that lined up too precisely with a weekend I'd spent 3 states away helping my sister move. But I want to go back and walk you through what happened in the days immediately after, because the real discovery wasn't the affair itself. It was what the affair helped me finally see clearly about everything around it. The morning after I found the folder, I did something I want to describe carefully, because it's the moment the story pivots from something happening to me to something I started actively investigating. I logged into the shared family email account, the one my mother had given me access to years earlier, ostensibly so I could help manage some of her paperwork after my father's heart scare, and which I hadn't looked at in months. I want to be clear that I wasn't looking for anything related to Preston. I was, if I'm honest, looking for evidence about the preschool tuition request, some part of me still needing to understand whether my no 3 months earlier had actually been fair, still needing even then to audit my own boundary before I could trust it. What I found instead was a forwarded email chain from 6 weeks earlier, sent from Linda Ames to my mother with the subject line, "Just between us." The email was short. Linda wrote that Preston had been going through something with work stress, that she hoped Nora would be patient and not make it a bigger thing than it needs to be, and that she and my mother both knew how these things can look worse than they are, especially this close to a wedding. My mother's reply, sent 11 minutes later, read, "Of course, I've always told her not to go looking for problems. She trusts him completely, and honestly, so do I." I sat with that email for a long time. I want to describe the reaction honestly because I think it's more useful to you than if I performed some dramatic breakdown I didn't actually have. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I felt more than anything a strange, cold stillness, the same stillness I feel at work when I finally locate the line item that explains an entire spreadsheet's worth of numbers that hadn't been adding up. Not shock, recognition. Because here is what that email chain proved, in a way the photographs from Cabo never could have on their own. This was not a private failure of one man's judgment during a work trip. This was known. It was known by my mother 6 weeks before my wedding, and quite possibly longer. And rather than warning me, my own mother had participated in a coordinated effort with the mother of the man cheating on me to manage my reaction in advance, to preload me with the instruction not to go looking for problems, so that when the moment came, I'd already have been trained not to look too closely. I want to name something here because I think it's the emotional center of this whole discovery. It wasn't the affair that broke something in me. Infidelity, as devastating as it is at least a private betrayal, one person's choice, made in a hotel room that could in theory have stayed contained to just the two of us working through it, or not. What broke something was learning that my own mother had chosen, given the exact information I needed, to protect my fiancé's comfort and her relationship with his family over my right to know something true and important about my own life. She had in effect cautioned this lie the same way I had once cautioned Camille's car loan. Quietly, without asking me, assuming I'd absorb the cost without complaint, because that's simply who I'd always been in this family. That's the machinery of it, laid completely bare. It was never really about Camille needing more or Preston working hard or any of the individual justifications I'd absorbed for over a decade. It was about a family, 2 families by this point, that had learned collectively that Nora doesn't make a fuss. Nora handles it. Nora will find a way to make the numbers work, even when the number is her own broken heart, 4 days before her wedding. I found 2 more things that week, quickly, methodically, the way I've been trained to work through a file once I know there's a discrepancy worth chasing. The first was a text thread on Camille's laptop. She'd left it open at my parents' house while helping set up wedding favors, and I want to be honest that at that point I was actively looking, not accidentally stumbling, because I no longer trusted that anything in this family was accidental. The thread was between Camille and Preston from 4 months earlier, and it read in part, "Camille, you good, Mom says keep it low-key till after the wedding. Preston, yeah, it's basically over anyway, just bad timing." Camille, lol, bad timing is an understatement. Secret's safe, don't worry about Nora, she's not the type to snoop. She's not the type to snoop. I read that line more times than I'd like to admit because it captures more precisely than anything else in this story exactly how I'd been categorized by the people closest to me, not as someone with the right to know things about my own life, but as a type. A type that doesn't snoop. A type that doesn't make a fuss. A type, in other words, that is safe to lie to. The second thing I found was smaller, but somehow it was the one that finally, fully, quietly broke the last thread of my old rationalizations. It was a calendar invite on the shared Ames family assistant's calendar, Richard Ames employed a part-time personal assistant who also helped coordinate some wedding logistics on Linda's side, since our families had, over the 2 prior years, become genuinely intertwined. The invite was titled Wedding Seating Adjustments per L. Ames plus D. Halstead, dated 11 days before the wedding, scheduling a call between Linda and my mother to discuss final table placements to keep things smooth. I hadn't authorized that call. I was the one managing the seating chart. My mother and my future mother-in-law had scheduled a private conversation without me to adjust my own wedding seating. Very possibly, I understood immediately, to make sure Vivian Cho, whoever's +1 she might quietly be positioned as or whatever role she'd been slotted into, ended up somewhere convenient, somewhere smooth. I want to pause here and tell you about the 4 days themselves, not just what I found, but what it was actually like to move through the ordinary motions of the week leading up to my wedding while carrying all of this in complete silence. I went to a final dress fitting on the Tuesday, standing on a small platform in front of 3 mirrors while a seamstress pinned the hem, my mother watching from a chair nearby, commenting on how beautiful I looked, and I remember thinking with a strange, detached clarity that I was watching a woman in a mirror get fitted for a wedding that half the room already knew was built on a lie. I smiled. I thanked the seamstress. I did not, even once, let my face show what I was doing behind it, and I want to be honest that some part of me is still unsettled by how easily I managed that, by how much practice 33 years had apparently given me at performing calm I didn't feel. I went to work on the Wednesday, because I had 2 loan files due and hadn't yet decided to take the rest of the week off, and I remember sitting across from a young couple applying for their first mortgage, walking them through their debt-to-income ratio with total focus, and thinking that it was strange and maybe telling that the one place I felt fully like myself that week was a windowless office reviewing someone else's numbers, rather than anywhere near the people who were supposed to love me most. I didn't confront anyone that week. I want to be honest that this was a deliberate choice, not paralysis. I have built an entire career on the principle that you gather every piece of the file before you present your findings, because a confrontation built on partial information is just an argument. And an argument is exactly the kind of thing this family had spent 30 years training me to lose quietly on my own, so as not to disturb everyone else's peace. I wasn't interested in an argument. I was interested in the truth, laid out so plainly that no one in the room could talk their way around it. So instead, I opened my own laptop in the quiet of my apartment 4 days before my wedding, and I did the only thing I have ever really known how to do when the numbers don't add up. I started building the file. The decision. I called my friend Priya first, the same cousin from Camille's wedding 6 years earlier, who had once told me in a kitchen while I refilled ice that I was allowed to just be a guest sometimes. Priya had gone on to become a family law attorney in Charlotte, and though she wasn't representing me in any formal capacity, she was the first person I trusted enough to say the words out loud. I found out Preston's been having an affair, I told her, sitting on my kitchen floor at 11 at night, 4 days before the wedding, phone on speaker because my hands weren't quite steady enough to hold it to my ear. And I found out my mother's known for at least 6 weeks, maybe longer. Priya was quiet for a moment, the good kind of quiet, the kind that tells you someone is actually thinking rather than rushing to comfort you into silence. Then she asked the question that ended up shaping everything I did next. Okay, setting aside the wedding for a second, what do you actually want to be true 3 months from now? I didn't have an answer right away. I want to be honest that my first instinct, even after everything, was to ask what the least disruptive path forward looked like. Whether there was a version of this where I quietly canceled the wedding, told people it wasn't the right time, and let my family construct whatever narrative kept the peace, the way I'd let them construct every narrative for the previous 33 years. That's the part I want you to sit with, Priya said when I admitted that instinct out loud. Notice that even now, mid-crisis, the first shape your mind reaches for is the one where nobody else has to feel uncomfortable except you. You've been doing that so long it doesn't even register as a choice to you anymore. It just registers as being reasonable. I told her I didn't know how to tell the difference anymore between being reasonable and being erased. She didn't answer that right away either. When she did, it wasn't reassurance, it was a question, the kind of question I've come to understand good friends and good lawyers both specialize in. If Camille found this exact folder about Derek 4 days before her wedding, what would you tell her to do? I didn't hesitate. I told her I'd tell Camille to show everyone the folder, cancel nothing quietly, and let the people who lied to her sit in the consequences of it in daylight, in front of witnesses, the way she'd never once had to sit alone with anything in her whole life. Right, Priya said, so the question isn't really what you should do, you already know. The question is why you'd let your own sister have an answer you won't let yourself have. I sat with that for a long moment on my kitchen floor, and I want to be honest that it didn't land like relief. It landed like grief, a specific, old grief for every version of myself across 30 years who'd have given anything for someone to ask that question sooner. Priya heard the silence and let it be silence, for once not filling it, and then she said the line I've repeated to myself more times than I can count since. Nora, you don't owe anyone a graceful exit from something they built without your consent. I called my therapist, Dr. Akafer, the next morning, an emergency session, the first one I'd ever asked for outside our regular Tuesday slot. I'd been seeing her for about 2 years by that point, mostly to work through what I'd started calling in our sessions the invisible ledger, my own internal, lifelong accounting of who owed what to whom in my family, a ledger that never once in 3 decades showed a debt in my favor. I told her everything, the affair, the email chain, the text thread, the calendar invite. She let me talk for a long time before she said anything at all, which is, I've come to understand, one of the most valuable things a good therapist does. She doesn't rush you past the part where you're still assembling the shape of what happened to you. When she finally spoke, it wasn't about Preston at all. You've told me a 15-minute story, she said, and you haven't cried once and your voice hasn't shaken once. I'm not saying that to criticize you. I'm pointing at it because I think it's the whole pattern live in this room right now. Even telling me about the worst thing that's happened to you, some part of you is still managing the delivery so it doesn't cost anyone anything to hear. I told her I didn't know how to do it differently. She asked me to try anyway, to say out loud, without organizing it into a clean narrative first, what I actually felt. It took me almost a full minute to get a sentence out, and when it came, it surprised me. I feel stupid. I feel like everyone could see this except me, and the only reason I didn't see it is that I've spent my whole life trained not to look too closely at people who are supposed to love me. That's closer to the truth, she said. Stay there a second before you fix it into something calmer. We sat in that discomfort together for a while, longer than felt natural to me, longer than any conversation in my family had ever been allowed to sit in something unresolved. Then she asked me the question that ended up doing the most work of the entire session. What are you actually afraid of if you stop managing this quietly? Not what you think you should be afraid of. What actually comes up in your body when you imagine saying all of this out loud in front of everyone? I sat with that question for a long time, and the answer that came when I finally let myself say it was the truest thing I'd said in years, maybe the truest thing I'd ever said out loud about my own family. If I stop being the one who fixes everything quietly, if I stop being useful, I don't actually know if they'll still want me around. I don't know who I am to them underneath what I do for them. Dr. Akafer didn't try to reassure me out of that fear. I think that's part of why I trust her. She let it sit in the room for a moment, and then she said, gently, that's a real fear, and it might even turn out to be partly true. Some of these relationships may not survive you no longer being useful in the way they're used to. But I want you to notice something. You just described a family that has shown you, through 30 years of evidence, that your value to them is conditional on your usefulness. If that's true, then the version of you that keeps being quietly useful forever isn't actually protecting the relationship. It's just delaying the moment you find out the relationship was never what you needed it to be. I asked her, half joking, half not, whether that meant I should expect to lose my whole family over this. She didn't flinch from the question the way I half hoped she would. I don't know, she said. I genuinely don't. What I know is that right now, today, you don't actually have a relationship with your mother or your sister or your fiancé. You have a role in each of their lives, and the role is the one who absorbs this so we don't have to. You might lose that role. You might, over time, build something realer in its place with some of them. But you can't find out which one it is while you're still protecting the role. I asked her the harder version of the question, the one underneath the first one, the one I hadn't said out loud to anyone yet, not even Priya. What if it turns out there's nothing underneath the role? What if I stop being useful and there's just nothing there, no relationship at all, just an empty space where I used to be? Dr. Akafer let that question breathe for a while before she answered it, and when she did, her voice was quieter than before. then that will be a devastating thing to learn, and I will help you grieve it, and it will still be truer and kinder to you than living inside a lie about what these relationships actually are. But Nora, I want to name something. You just told me 15 minutes ago about a voicemail from your father. About a cousin who told you 6 years ago, unprompted, that you're allowed to just be a guest. About a teacher who told you at 14 that you don't have to earn your place in every room. Those are 3 people, completely independent of each other, who saw something in you worth protecting without you doing anything to earn it in the moment. That's not nothing. That's evidence the fear is telling you a partial story, not the whole one. I want to give this section the room it deserves, because Priya was right that this is the emotional core of everything, not the affair, not even my mother's complicity, but this specific old load-bearing fear. Who am I to any of these people if I stop being the one who makes their numbers balance? I don't think that fear resolved cleanly in that session, and I don't think it's fully resolved even now, months later, as I tell you this story. But something shifted that morning on Dr. Akaffer's couch that hadn't shifted in 33 years. I stopped treating the fear as a fact I had to organize my whole life around and started treating it as a question I was, for the first time, actually allowed to go find the answer to. I spent the 2 days after that session doing something I hadn't done in longer than I could remember. I sat with old memories deliberately, on purpose, the way you'd review a case file, instead of letting them surface and pass the way they usually did. I thought about the bicycle with the 2 small tires. I thought about the state finals nobody attended. I thought about the lamp I was asked to clean up before my father came home, and the loan I cosigned at 22, and the wedding I half paid for at 26, and the 14 years cumulatively of being told some version of "you're the strong one, you don't need what she needs." And I thought, too, about my father's voicemail, "You did the right thing saying no, I should have said no more myself," over the years, and about Priya's kitchen comment from 6 years earlier, and about a strange, small memory I hadn't thought about in ages. A teacher in 8th grade, Mrs. Halloran, who'd pulled me aside after I turned in an extra credit project nobody had asked for and said, "Nora, you don't have to earn your place in every room you walk into. Some rooms are just supposed to be yours." I hadn't understood what she meant at 14. I understood it, finally, at 33, 4 days before my wedding, sitting on my therapist's couch. I called Priya back that same evening, not for legal advice this time, but just to talk it through out loud one more time before I acted on anything. I told her what Dr. Akaffer had said about the role versus the relationship, and Priya went quiet for a moment before she said something that stayed with me since. You know what's strange? In 6 years of family law, I've watched dozens of people finally set a boundary, and almost every one of them describes the same specific fear right before they do it, that the moment they stop being useful, they'll find out there was never anything else holding the relationship up. Most of them are surprised, one way or another, by what they actually find on the other side. Some lose people. Some find out the relationship was realer than they thought once it wasn't the only thing propping it up. I can't tell you which one you're going to get. Nobody can going in, but I can tell you that the not knowing isn't a reason to stay quiet, it's just the actual cost of finding out. Here is the decision I actually made, and I want to be precise about it, because it wasn't cancel the wedding and it wasn't confront everyone and burn it all down, even though I understand why either of those might feel like the satisfying answer. What I decided was this. I was done managing the truth on everyone else's behalf, quietly to protect their comfort. If the wedding happened, it was going to happen with everyone in that room seeing exactly what I had seen. Not because I wanted revenge, though I won't pretend some small human part of me didn't want the people who'd lied to me to feel even a fraction of the cold clarity I'd felt in that 11-minute stillness at Preston's desk. But because I had spent 33 years being the only person in every room who was required to know the whole truth and act gracefully anyway. And I was finished volunteering for that role without being asked, let alone thanked for it in any currency other than a hug and the word strong. I called a lawyer the same afternoon, not Priya since she wasn't licensed in my state, but a colleague she referred me to, a woman named Fatima Reyes who specialized in exactly the kind of quiet, methodical unwinding I needed. Canceled vendor contracts, deposit recovery, and this was the part that mattered most, a clear-eyed read on what I was and wasn't legally and practically able to do with 4 days left before an event 210 people were expecting to attend. Fatima's first question wasn't about the affair at all, it was about paperwork. Whose name is on the venue contract? Whose name is on the deposits? I told her mine, every vendor contract, every deposit, all of it, because I was the one who'd built and managed the spreadsheet for a year. She was quiet for a second, and then she said something that reframed the entire next 4 days for me. Then I want to make sure you understand something clearly before we go any further. You are not a guest at this wedding, legally or operationally. You are the client of record for every vendor involved in it. Whatever else this is emotionally, you are also factually the only person in this story with the actual authority to decide what Saturday looks like. I asked her carefully what my options actually were, not the emotionally satisfying ones, the real ones. She walked me through them without editorializing. I could cancel outright, which would cost me most of the non-refundable deposits but end the event entirely. I could postpone, which would require notifying 210 people on 4 days' notice, and would likely read to most of them as a crisis without an explanation. Or I could let the day proceed exactly as scheduled, retaining full control over its operational details, including, she pointed out, things as specific as the seating chart, the guest list, and any additions or changes to either, since none of that required anyone's approval but mine. You're not obligated to protect anyone's comfort here, Fatima told me, in the same calm, factual register I recognized instantly because it was the same register I use myself when I'm about to tell a client something they don't want to hear. You built the guest list. You built the seating chart. Nobody has more operational control over this event than you do. The only question is what you actually want that control to accomplish. I asked her, half hoping she'd talk me out of it, whether adding someone new to a guest list 4 days before a wedding, someone like Marcus Cho, a man I'd never met whose life was about to be upended by information I possessed and he didn't, was something I was legally and ethically allowed to do. She didn't talk me out of it. Legally, you can invite whoever you want to an event you're paying for, she said. Ethically, I'd ask you the same question I ask every client in a moment like this. Are you doing it to hurt someone, or are you doing it because you believe he has a right to true information about his own life that other people have decided, for their own convenience, to withhold from him? Those aren't always easy to tell apart in the moment. But you strike me as someone who already knows the difference, or you wouldn't have called a lawyer 4 days out instead of just doing it. I knew by the end of that call exactly what I wanted my control over that day to accomplish. I opened my laptop. I pulled up the seating chart I had built and maintained obsessively for the better part of a year, and I began calmly, methodically, the way I've built 100 loan files before, to change the guest list. The confrontation. I'm not going to pretend the wedding day itself unfolded exactly as I'd planned down to the minute, because no plan built around 210 human beings ever does. But I want to walk you through what I actually did, because I think the specifics matter more than the drama. I did not cancel the wedding. I let the ceremony proceed almost exactly as scheduled, in the same venue with the same officiant, because, and I want to be honest about this, some part of me needed every person in that room to be present for what came after, and canceling would have let too many of them quietly avoid the truth the way they'd spent months helping to bury it. I want to describe the morning of the wedding itself for a moment, because I think the calm of it surprised even me. I got my hair and makeup done alongside Camille and 2 bridesmaids in a hotel suite overlooking the river, and I laughed at the right moments, and I let my mother cry a little when she saw me in the dress, and none of it was performance in the cynical sense. Some part of it was even genuinely lovely. The last quiet hour before I stopped being someone who managed the day and started being someone who let the day happen to everyone else for once. I remember looking at myself in the mirror, veil pinned, and thinking with a steadiness that surprised me that whatever happened in the next several hours, I would not be the only person leaving that room changed by the end of it. The ceremony itself went exactly as planned, and I let it. Preston and I said the vows we'd written months earlier before any of this, and I said mine without flinching, because I'd decided sometime in the previous 4 days that the vows themselves weren't the lie, they were true when I wrote them, and I wasn't going to let anyone else's dishonesty rewrite what had been honest in me. It was only once we moved into the reception, once 210 people had taken their seats and found, with visible confusion, that the tables weren't arranged the way the printed programs said they would be, that the day began to shift into the version of itself I had actually built. What I changed was smaller and far more precise. I removed exactly 4 names from the reception's head table and inner circle seating. My mother moved from the family table to a table near the back, seated beside my father, whom I did not move because he had not participated in the machinery. He'd only finally, near the end, started naming it. I moved Linda Ames from the Ames family's place of honor to a table beside 3 of Richard Ames's most senior business partners. a placement I selected with deliberate care because I happened to know, from something Preston had mentioned months earlier without understanding its future relevance, that Richard valued discretion in front of exactly these three men above almost anything else. And I added one name that had not been on any guest list at all. Marcus Cho, Vivian Cho's husband, whom I'd never met, but whose contact information I'd found easily on a public professional networking profile, and to whom I'd sent a short, factual email 2 days before the wedding, explaining only that I believed he deserved to know some information regarding his wife's recent business travel, along with the same photographs and dates I'd found in that Cabo folder, and the date, time, and location of an event he was welcome, though under no obligation, to attend. He came. I want to be clear that I did not orchestrate a public scene between him and anyone. That was never the plan, and it isn't what happened. I simply believed and still believe that if my family and my fiancé had decided a stranger's marriage was an acceptable casualty of managing my comfort quietly, then that stranger deserved the same access to the truth that had been withheld from me for 6 weeks minimum, by people who called themselves my family. The confrontation itself happened not during the ceremony, and not even really at one single moment. It unfolded in pieces over the course of the reception the way real reckonings usually do, rather than in one clean cinematic scene. But there was a central moment about 40 minutes into the reception, when Preston pulled me aside near the gift table, visibly rattled, having clearly clocked both the seating changes and Marcus Cho's unexpected presence across the room near Vivian. "What is this?" he said, low, urgent, already sliding toward anger the way people do when they sense the ground shifting under something they thought was settled. "Why is her husband here? Why did you move my mother?" I had brought, in a plain black folder I'd kept in my bag all day, printed copies of the photographs, the boarding pass, the email chain between Linda and my mother, and the text thread between Preston and Camille. I hadn't decided, walking into that day, whether I would actually show them to anyone or whether their existence in my possession would be enough. But standing there, watching Preston's face do the same thing it had done the morning I asked him about Denver, that same specific, unnecessary detail about hotel Wi-Fi, this time replaced with a specific, unnecessary detail about how Marcus must have misunderstood something, I opened the folder. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be honest that a part of me expected to in the moment, and was almost surprised at how steady it actually was, the same steadiness I bring to a difficult client meeting, because by that point I had spent 4 days turning this exact conversation over so many times that there was nothing left in it that could actually surprise me anymore. "I'm not here to argue with you in front of 200 people, I told him quietly, the folder open between us. "I found the Cabo folder 5 days ago. I found the email your mother sent mine 6 weeks before this wedding telling her to keep me calm and not let me make it a bigger thing than it needs to be. I found the text where Camille told you not to worry because I'm not the type to snoop. I know all of it, Preston. I'm not confused, and I'm not confronting you because I want a scene. I moved some seats and sent one email because I've spent my whole life being the only person in every room who's expected to know the whole truth and behave gracefully anyway. I decided that today, for once, everyone else could sit with some of that truth too." My mother had arrived by then, drawn by the visible tension, Linda a few steps behind her, both women's faces doing the specific kind of performative confusion I recognized instantly as people who already suspected exactly what this was about. My mother reached for my arm, a gesture I'd have accepted unquestioningly for 30 years, and said, voice cracking, already reaching for tears, "Nora, please, not today, not like this. Think about what you're doing to everyone." I didn't pull my arm away sharply. I just moved it gently, the way you'd move a hand off a hot surface without needing to make a production of it. "I read your email to Linda," I said, still quiet, still even. "The one where you told her not to worry because I trust him completely, and so do you. I'd like you to think about what you did to me 6 weeks before my wedding before you ask me to think about anyone else today." My mother's face did something I'd genuinely never seen it do before, not anger, not performance, but a kind of collapse, brief and real, before it reassembled itself into something more defensible. "I didn't know what to do," she said, quieter now, less for the room and more, I think, for herself. "I've never known what to do with you when something's actually wrong. You've never once in your whole life let me know how." I want to be honest that this sentence landed harder than almost anything else said that day, because there was a kernel of truth buried inside the accusation, even though the accusation itself was misplaced. I hadn't let her know how to help me, not because I was withholding it as some kind of punishment, but because 30 years of evidence had taught me that asking wasn't a door that opened for me the way it opened for Camille. I didn't say all of that in the moment. I said simply, I didn't have practice. Nobody ever taught me it was safe to try. Camille had made her way over by then, Derek trailing a step behind her, her face pale, one hand pressed flat against her collarbone in a way I recognized from childhood as her particular signal of being caught. Nora, I swear, it wasn't. I didn't think it would actually go anywhere with Vivian. I thought it was already basically over when Preston told me. You told him not to worry about me, I said, still not raising my voice, though I felt something in my chest tighten for the first time all day. You called me a type, Cammy, not the type to snoop. I've spent our whole lives being the type who covers the car loan and the wedding and the groceries when you needed somewhere to land at 20, and I never once needed you to call me a type for any of that. I just needed you to think of me as someone with a right to the truth about my own life. That's all this ever was. Camille didn't have an answer for that. I watched her open her mouth twice and close it again, and for a moment standing there in a bridesmaid's dress she'd altered herself 2 weeks earlier. She looked less like the sun our whole household had orbited for 29 years and more like what she actually was in that moment. A 29-year-old woman realizing in real time in front of 200 people that a joke she'd made in a text message 8 months earlier had a cost she'd never once had to consider paying herself. Richard Ames reached us last, having clearly been alerted by his business partner's reaction to the seating change before he understood why it mattered. He didn't raise his voice either, I'll give him that much. And I think it's worth giving because it's the one moment in this whole confrontation where I saw something in an antagonist that wasn't purely self-protective. Nora, he said low, direct, looking not at Preston or at Linda but at me. Whatever's happened here today, I want you to know I didn't know about any of it until about 4 minutes ago. I'd have wanted better for you than this if I'd known. I mean that. I believed him mostly, I still do. It didn't undo what his wife had coordinated with my mother, or what his money had quietly funded for 2 years without my knowledge. But it was the only apology offered that day that didn't come wrapped in a request for me to feel bad for offering the truth in the first place, and I've never forgotten that distinction. And this is the line I want you to remember, because it's the one that landed the whole point of this story, the one I'd been building toward in one form or another since I was 9 years old and told I was old enough to understand why the bicycle went to someone else. I've spent my whole life thinking about what I was doing to everyone else, I said. Today, for the first time, I thought about what everyone else was doing to me. I want to tell you the room went silent, the way it does in movies, but that's not quite honest. There was a low, uncomfortable murmur, a few people quietly finding reasons to check their phones, Camille's face going pale near the dessert table where she'd been standing with Derek, Richard Ames's business partners, exchanging a glance at the table Linda had been moved to, clearly beginning to understand exactly why they'd been seated where they had. Vivian Cho left within minutes, Marcus following a short while after, the two of them having, I later learned, a conversation in the parking lot that was none of my business and never became any part of this story because it was never mine to narrate. Preston did not deny anything in the end. I think standing there, folder open, 4 days of careful documentation laid plainly between us, he understood there was nothing left to talk his way around. He said my name once quietly, something close to an apology forming, and I told him calmly, the same register I'd use closing out any file, that we could talk properly once the day was over, but that I wasn't interested in resolving anything for an audience. The wedding, as a wedding, ended there. There was no first dance. There was, I'm told, a great deal of quiet, tense conversation among guests for the rest of the evening, most of whom left within the hour. I didn't stay to manage any of it. For the first time in my adult life, I let a room I was standing in sort itself out without me. Aftermath. I want to be honest with you that the months following the wedding were not a clean redemption arc, and I don't think they should be told as one. This isn't a story where everyone apologized and we all healed together over a long dinner. Some of it stayed broken, and I've made peace with the fact that it probably always will. Preston and I did not reconcile. We had 2 conversations in the weeks after, one where he tried, genuinely I believe, to explain the affair as something that had just happened during a period of stress, and one 3 weeks later where he called to say he understood, finally, why the seating chart and the email to Marcus mattered more to me than his apology did. We haven't spoken since. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he left Pharaoh and Kite about 4 months later. I don't know the full story, and I've made a deliberate choice not to go looking for it. My relationship with my mother remains, as I write this, distant. We speak on major holidays briefly in the careful, formal register of two people who both know something significant broke and haven't found, or maybe haven't wanted to find, a way to repair it. She has never apologized for the email to Linda Ames. She did say once on a phone call about 6 weeks after the wedding, "I never wanted you to get hurt, Nora. I just didn't think it was my place to interfere." A sentence I've turned over many times because I think she genuinely believes it. And I think it's also, in its own way, perfect final example of the machinery, the idea that staying silent while someone you love walks into a wedding built on a lie is not interfering, rather than a choice with its own weight and its own cost. Camille and I have spoken exactly twice since the wedding. The first was angry on her end. She accused me of humiliating the whole family and making it about me when, in her words, it wasn't even my secret to keep. The second, 4 months later, was different. She called, unprompted, and told me that her older daughter, Ruthie, who's 7, had asked her recently why Aunt Nora doesn't come to family things anymore, and that trying to explain it to a 7-year-old had made her think, for the first time honestly, about what she'd actually done by texting Preston not to worry about me. She didn't fully apologize. But she said one thing that mattered to me more than an apology might have. "I don't want Ruthie growing up thinking the reliable one in the family is just supposed to absorb whatever the rest of us don't want to deal with. I don't want her to be you, or me, honestly, either." I don't know yet what becomes of that conversation. I've chosen to leave the door open a small amount, not because I'm certain it will lead anywhere, but because I no longer feel obligated to leave it open all the way, either, which is its own kind of progress, for someone who spent 30 years believing the door had to stay open regardless of what walked in and out of it. Linda Ames sent me a card about a month after the wedding, handwritten, which surprised me, given everything. It didn't apologize for the phone call with my mother exactly, but it came close in the careful, deflecting language of someone unused to apologizing directly. "I'm sorry for whatever part I played in a day that should have been happy for you. I hope you know it was never meant as cruelty." I believe that mostly the same way I believe Richard's words to me on the day itself, that it wasn't cruelty precisely so much as a lifetime of prioritizing smoothness over truth, in a family that had, in its own way, trained its members toward the same quiet machinery mine had. I wrote back a short, polite note. "We haven't spoken since, and I don't expect we will, and I've made my peace with that being the natural, undramatic end of a relationship that was never really mine to maintain in the first place. It belonged to my mother and Linda, long before it ever had anything to do with me." Richard Ames, oddly, has stayed more present at the edges of my life than almost anyone else from that day, mostly through Camille, since he remains her employer. I heard, secondhand, that he quietly adjusted the terms of the loan he'd given Derek 2 years earlier, forgiving a portion of it, in what Camille described to me as his way of trying to make up for some of it, I think, even though he says it's not related. I don't know what to make of that gesture, and I've decided I don't need to make anything of it at all. It doesn't undo what his money helped obscure. It doesn't need to be weighed against anything either. It's simply true, and I've found since the wedding that I no longer feel obligated to turn every true thing into a verdict. My father and I talk more now than we ever have. It's not dramatic, mostly short calls, sometimes just about a crossword clue he's stuck on, but it's steadier than anything we had before, and I think we both understand, without needing to say it directly, that his one voicemail 4 days before the wedding was the first time either of us had told the other the truth about what our family actually was. I still see Priya. She's become, in the months since, something closer to a real friend than a cousin I only saw at family events, and I think that's its own small, quiet redemption thread running through all of this, proof that not every relationship in this family was built on the same broken foundation, even if the ones closest to the center were. I also want to tell you about something smaller, something that had nothing to do with any of the people in the story directly, because I think it matters just as much as any of the reconciliations or ruptures. About 2 months after the wedding, my manager at the bank asked me, almost offhand, whether I'd be interested in finally applying for the team lead position that had opened up. the same track of promotion that Austin Conference years earlier had been meant to start me on. I'd quietly avoided applying for roles like it for years, telling myself I didn't have the bandwidth, never quite naming, even to myself, that the bandwidth I didn't have was mostly being spent somewhere else entirely. I applied. I got it. It's a small, unglamorous kind of victory compared to everything else in this story, but I think about it often because it's proof of something Dr. Akaffer told me in one of our sessions that fall, that the space this family had been occupying in me for 30 years wasn't just emotional. It was actual, literal capacity, hours, attention, energy, and once some of it was finally freed up, it didn't just sit there empty. It went somewhere. It went toward my own life for what I think might be the first time since I was 9 years old and someone else's bicycle arrived before mine did. I moved 6 months after the wedding into a smaller apartment across town, closer to work, further from Marsh Hollow. It wasn't a dramatic decision. I didn't frame it, even to myself, as symbolic. But I noticed, unpacking the last box on a Sunday afternoon alone, that for the first time in longer than I could remember, nothing in the apartment existed because someone else needed it to. Every object in those rooms was there because I had chosen it, for reasons that began and ended with me. It's a strange thing to notice how unfamiliar that feels at 33 after a lifetime of choosing things for other people first. The thesis. I said something to my therapist a few weeks after the wedding that she asked me to write down because she said I'd want it later, and she was right. Being called the strong one was never a compliment. It was a job title nobody paid me for, and I was the last person in my own family to read the fine print. I think about that sentence often now, not with bitterness, though I won't pretend there isn't some bitterness left in me somewhere that may never fully clear. I think about it because it's the truest thing I know about what happened to me, and maybe the truest thing I know about a lot of families that look, from the outside, like they simply have one child who's easier than the other. Easier is rarely a personality trait. Usually it's a job description quietly assigned before anyone old enough to understand the terms was ever asked to agree to them. If there's one thing I'd want a younger version of myself to hear, the 9-year-old with the too small bicycle, the 14-year-old at the state finals with an empty row of seats behind her, the 17-year-old on the landline asking a stranger what an EFC was, it's this. Being needed is not the same as being loved, even when the people around you use the words interchangeably, even when they mean well, even when some of what they offer you back is genuinely warm. You're allowed to ask which one you're actually getting. You're allowed to find out the answer, even if the answer costs you something. I did. It cost me a wedding day I'd planned for a year, and a mother I speak to twice a year now instead of twice a week, and a sister I'm still, carefully, deciding whether to let back in. It also gave me the first version of my own life I've ever fully recognized as mine. I don't know yet fully whether that trade was worth it in every sense. I know it was honest, and after 33 years, honest was the one thing I'd never actually had. Outro. If any part of my story found its way into your own life, if you've ever been the one who fixes things quietly, who gets thanked with a hug instead of an apology, who found out, one folder or one phone call at a time, exactly how much you'd been carrying without ever being asked whether you could, I want you to know you're not alone in this, and I'm genuinely glad you spent this time with me. Tell me in the comments where your own story overlaps with mine, even just a little. I read every single one, and I mean that. If this one moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for sitting with me through this. I'll see you in the next story.